Hi everyone. We're in my living room right now, so because we're not really going to be doing any cooking today, we're just going to talk about a couple of things. I've been recently watching this TV show called Worst Cooks in America, and it gets together people who. It's like a Food Network reality TV show. It's like a competition type of show, and they get together a bunch of people who it's a self-identified thing, and I'm sure it's a thing that their family members have also said, where they believe or they've noticed that when they cook, things don't always go out very well, or it doesn't come out like they had planned on having it come out, or it, it, it just comes out gross. And I've started to notice a couple of things with what happens to the contestants, which creates like little roadblocks along the way for them that makes it difficult for them to have a good cooking experience or have decent tasting food coming out of their kitchens. And I wanted to talk about a couple of those things because I've also noticed a couple of my friends who are pretty good cooks fall into these same traps where things could have gone fine if we had spent just a couple of minutes pausing and thinking and doing some preparation before we jump in headfirst on a serious cooking session where there's a lot to get done. And I wanted to go through a couple of those things. I made some notes on my phone, so if I look away from the camera, that's why, because I'm looking at my notes. The biggest thing that I've noticed with all these contestants is that there's and I understand why there's this huge lack of belief that they're capable of making good food. So they're starting at this place of like severe self-doubt and anxiety, and they're not very sure of themselves. So they're starting off at a handicap where they go into the kitchen and they think already this is going to be a bad experience. This is going to be a disaster. I'm not going to be able to do a good job with doing it. And of course, because it's a competition reality show, all their cooking prompts are done on very squeezed timelines. So although you or I would consider something to be a reasonable timeline, somebody who's a beginner cook who's not very confident in the kitchen will need extra time, and this is not a reasonable timeline for them. Um, Especially when you're asking the person to switch gears in between and make multiple different types of dishes. So they'll have like a prompt where they'll say, okay, we're going to make like an Asian inspired thing, and then they'll do like 4 or 5 different dishes, and they have to complete it within an allotted amount of time. Um, and you'll see the ones who don't do very well, they start off with this I can't do it mentality, and they've already defeated themselves long before they even stepped into the kitchen. And it starts there. It begins with this attitude of I can't do it, and this is going to be terrible, and I'm going to have a bad time, and I'm not going to be able to do it. If you find yourself getting nervous before you go into the kitchen, because to be honest, I find myself doing it to myself when I have somebody coming over who I really respect or that I really care about, and I want to make sure that whatever I cook comes out well for them. I'm gonna have this natural anxiety, this natural, nervousness that this isn't gonna go as well as I expected it to go, and that I'm gonna have to do some damage control later on. So when I find myself having these thoughts and I find myself having these attitudes, I need to stop and step away from myself for a moment and just like take a deep breath and tell myself, you aren't going to be making anything new that you haven't made before. This is another side tip that I want to keep in the back of your mind. Whenever I have people coming over, whether for the first time or the millionth time, I might experiment with a couple of the spices. I might experiment with a couple of techniques. I might, tweak certain things here and there, but I'll never make a dish that I've never made before. It'll be something that I've done a million times that I know that I'm confident in doing, so I'm not really fussing about with complex techniques, or with anything else that's gonna slow me down or make this whole thing into a disaster. um, I'm not going to open a recipe book for the first time and try to cook something for somebody else. I'll do that on my own time when it's just me and I don't have somebody who's depending on dinner happening at my house. I'll make sure that if somebody's coming over, it's something that I've made so many times that I can be confident about it. But even with all that, I still have those moments of anxiety and nervousness and thinking that I can't do it, and we all do. These are natural feelings. When you find yourself getting into that "I can't do it" mentality, you want to stop and just take like 5-10 seconds to breathe and just clear your head and say, okay, win, lose, or draw. At the end of the day, it's probably going to be edible. Worst comes to it, I'll call the Chinese restaurant that's local to me and have them deliver something, and we'll all have a good time eating that. Once you take away that extreme pressure and that "I can't do it" attitude, then things go a lot smoother. Um, Another thing that I've noticed that a lot of the beginner cooks do, where especially in this show because it's a competition reality show, everything's all compressed, they tend to rush. And when I say they tend to rush, I mean they'll zip through reading the recipe, they'll try to zip through doing their setup, they'll try to like rush everything, and at the end of the day, nothing gets done because everything was done sort of half-hearted. It wasn't done to the fullest of its ability. It wasn't done to where you took your time and did everything properly. It's more like get this done, get this done, get this done, and then everything comes out a disaster because you didn't give yourself enough time to breathe and to actually take the time to really think about what you're doing and do it the right way. These are also when kitchen accidents happen. You're going too fast with like a mandolin or your knife or something like that, and you cut your hand, or you're going too fast and you forget to use safety equipment when you're handling hot pots and pans. And my chemistry teacher from high school and from college, all my chemistry teachers would say hot glass looks like cold glass, just like hot metal looks like cold metal. So like if you reach out your hand for your cast iron skillet that's sitting on the stove at that medium heat that you want to keep it at, so that you can control the heat, you're gonna burn your hand if you don't have something to protect your hand when you're reaching for that hot metal. And these accidents happen when you're rushing, when you're trying to get something done too quickly. You rush, and when you're rushing, you're not pausing to think about, okay, what am I about to do right now? Should I really be doing this? So multiple times I'm watching these episodes and I see somebody like reach for a pot that's screaming hot on the stove and they have nothing on their hand to protect it and they get hurt, or they're going so fast that none of the prep work that they've done is really what it needs to be. So when it's time to add that particular thing to the recipe, it ends up being a disaster anyway because it's not what it's supposed to be. And so now you have to go back and do damage control, and then it becomes this whole thing. And so what should have realistically taken you 20-30 minutes or so in preparation time has now stretched out to making this process take way longer than it needs to because you didn't give yourself enough time to do all the steps. Um, this goes double for if you have somebody coming over and you're feeling bad because they have to wait on food happening. It's better that everybody wait on the dinner happening than you hurt yourself or you do a bad job with putting everything together. It's better that we all wait. Worst comes to it, whoever's coming over will probably want to help out in the kitchen anyway. So get them on doing some of those tasks that you don't like doing, and the bunch of you all work on it together to get the meal done. So like I heard this quote from one of my chef friends. He says, "Speed is accuracy," where you you only get fast at something and you only do something in a timely fashion if you're doing it accurately. If you're doing it poorly and you're not for example, here's a simple example. If you're chopping up vegetables to go into a pot, all the pieces of the vegetables should be, if not the exact same size, as close to the same size as you can get it. And if they're not, what ends up happening is that each piece takes a different amount of time to cook. And so your final dish ends up tasting weird because some of the big pieces aren't cooked all the way through and some of the small pieces are obliterated and they've dissolved into the outside liquid or whatever. So if you stop and you take your time and you try to chop all your vegetables the same exact size, it means that when you add it to the recipe, it's you're not going to need to do damage control. It's going to be just fine. It'll carry on cooking like it's supposed to. And okay, maybe it takes a little bit longer if you chopped it a little bit bigger, or maybe it takes a little bit less time because you chopped it a little bit smaller. Point is that as long as it's all the consistent size, as long as it's the same size, the dish will come out just fine. But that's really difficult to do if you're rushing. If you're thinking, oh gosh, my friends are coming in the next half hour and I haven't even started peeling the potatoes yet that need to go into this dish, what am I going to do? And then you start rushing the potatoes and you cut yourself. And now you have to go to the bathroom, wash your hands, put on a Band-Aid. And then you go back to peeling the potatoes and now you're chopping them. But because you're rushing, you're not chopping them in the right sizes so that when they go into the dish, now what you expected to take a half hour really took closer to like 45 minutes to an hour because some of the big pieces weren't cooked all the way through and some of the small pieces, I mean, they're going to get cooked regardless, but if you had just taken a little bit of extra time and slowed down, even if it took you longer to finish the task, you didn't have to stop what you're doing. You didn't have to interrupt yourself to go put on a Band-Aid or to go clean up this disaster area that you've made. It's gonna go into the pot in the way that you expected it to go, and there's no surprises. This will take about as long as it says it's gonna take, and you're not worrying, oh gosh, what did I do wrong? Why isn't this doing what I needed to do? And then here's another thing that people do when they're rushing is you didn't chop the vegetables quite the right size, and now the recipe is not cooking as fast as the recipe says it should. So then you crank up the heat to as high as it goes. And again, because you're rushing and you're running around the kitchen like a crazy person, you reach for the pot handle, it's screaming hot, you burn your hand. Now you have to go attend to that. Meanwhile, the stove is still on screaming high heat, and probably you've ended up burning whatever it is that you've been cooking. So now you not only have the issue of the smallest pieces getting obliterated, the bigger pieces being half raw, now you've also got the bottom layer of your food burnt, and you've also burned your hand. And all this was not necessary. We didn't need to put ourselves through all this aggravation if we had just slowed down. And I'll probably mention slow down a couple of other times because these are tips that you want to have in the back of your brain anytime you're cooking. If you're cooking, have me in your head, like standing on your shoulder saying, guys, why are you going so fast? Slow it down. This will be fine. You don't need to go this quickly. With all this panic and with this fear and this anxiety and this nervousness, the kitchen is a dangerous place. There are sharp objects. There's knives. There's glass. There's all kinds of things in the kitchen that can hurt you. There's screaming hot stoves. There's screaming hot ovens. In my kitchen, there's literal fires because I have a gas stove. You don't want to mess around and run around like a person who, doesn't have their act together. You want to take your time and be methodical and do your best to go slower. Slower is sometimes better because then you only have to do that thing once. You're not doing damage control later. Everything proceeds as predicted, and now we're not running back and trying to fix mistakes that really we didn't need to make in the first place. Another thing in restaurants, they have this word mise en place, which means everything in its place. You have, before you start cooking a recipe, if you're a beginner, especially if you're a beginner, you want to really have about 95% of that stuff prepared before you turn on the stove. So let's use the example of one of my vegetable soups. if you've ever seen my videos where I'm filming for the vegetable soup, I'll have all those various vegetables chopped up into pieces inside little bowls, waiting for me to throw it into the pot, so that when I turn on the heat and I add my spices and I add my other ingredients one by one, everything goes fairly quickly and I'm not rushing around trying to figure myself out. I do that for the camera because I need to present to you a very methodical and very logical way of doing things so that when you try it at home on your own, you can replicate my results. I don't need to necessarily be that careful about having everything laid out in front of me. Um, I can do the thing where I'll chop up an onion, throw it on the stove, let it park on medium low heat, and then start chopping up the other vegetables that go into the soup. But I've been cooking for a very, very long time. And I've been in the kitchen with, my family, by myself, whatever, for decades. I am a very experienced cook. For me, it's not necessary to have everything neatly laid out in front of me, like you see on my videos or like you see on most cooking videos. I I know how long it takes me to do these tasks, so I have that luxury of being able to sort of break up my tasks in such a way that everything's going to be able to be finished on time. If you're not an experienced cook, don't try to replicate that at home. Take the extra time, chop up everything, put it into little bowls, have it all laid out for yourself, because that way, and like I said, this is for beginner cooks. If you're a more advanced cook, you've already got your system in place with how you approach cooking. You already know roughly what you need to do to get the job done. You don't need me to tell you, you know, this is how long it's going to take you to put on the kettle to boil some water so that while the onion is sauteing, you have boiling water ready for after you add the vegetables. The water comes up to the heat very quickly and you don't have to wait for it. I don't have to tell you all that if you're an advanced cook, but if you're a beginner cook, take your time and just lay everything out for yourself, because what that's going to do for you is that when you start cooking this recipe that you've never made before, it's it's going to speed things up significantly when you're actually in the process of making the actual recipe. Yes, the first few times it's going to be a little bit of a pain, to have to chop everything up and clear all the garbage away and get everything all neatly arranged. But once it becomes a habit, these things become a lot easier over time. And then when you become more advanced and you become more used to cooking, you start figuring out, okay, I don't necessarily need to do this particular step right now. I can wait while the stove is doing its own thing, because you've already figured out your own process. But until such point, lay out everything, have it all ready in front of you. Um, you it's not going to hurt you to have some preparation done ahead of time, because again, I'm in watching this show, The Worst Cooks in America. A lot of the contestants, they forget that prep stage and they just try to jump into making the recipe, and disaster happens, and you see spectacular disasters happening because they didn't take the time to prep their space first. Speaking of prep, have your safety equipment out in front of you. It doesn't hurt anything to have your dry towels, and I specify dry towels for when you're using them as heat protection for your hands when you're picking up hot things off the stove. Make sure that it's a dry towel, because if it's a wet towel, the water will instantly evaporate and it'll hurt your hand with a burn. So dry towels is what you want to be using, if you're trying to use it like as a pot holder or something to protect your hands while you're cooking. Have oven mitts, have those little oven holder, those pot holder thingies that they sell at the store. Have those out waiting for you right next to your cooking area. So, for example, on my stove, I generally only use one burner at a time, unless I'm making a really elaborate meal and I need to use a couple of burners. But in those cases, what I'll do is that I'll start something on the stove and then shove it in the oven and park it in there while I'm using the one burner at a time. So what I'll do is that the burner that I'm using, I'll have actively going, and then I'll have my oven mitts or my pot holder or my dry towels sitting right next to me on the other empty burner that doesn't have any heat on. The reason that you want to have it right there is that if for some reason, heaven forbid, if something crazy happens, like say for example your pot catches on fire because the oil's too hot, or you smell burning and you need to turn something off really quickly and get the pot off the heat, you want to have your safety equipment right there so that you don't have to go searching for it when you're in a panic. When you're in a panic, you want to reduce the amount of extra steps that you need to take to keep yourself safe as much as humanly possible. So have your pot holders, have your dry towels, have your everything right there next to you, ready to use immediately. Same thing goes for you guys must have seen in my kitchen where I have those stacks and stacks of side towels. You want to have lots and lots of side towels because spills happen, either on the floor or on your person or on the stove, or gucky stuff gets on your hands. You want to have something to clean it up with, which is not like a paper towel, because using paper towels for everything is pretty wasteful. Fills up our landfills. It's not the best option. You want to have side towels and then just wash them as and when you need to. Um, but basically, first and foremost, have that good attitude that I can do this. Secondly, slow down. But thirdly, have enough equipment out there that's going to help safety, as much as possible. If you're doing any deep frying, have a fire extinguisher, or like a box of salt that you can pour on in case something catches on fire. Um, or like a thing of baking soda, or like the pot lid to slam on shut. You Just a side note on safety: if you have an oil fire, so like if you're deep frying and the oil catches on fire, don't add water to it. That's going to just make an explosion and things are going to get worse. The quickest way to stop a oil fire, if you have the lid for the pot, is to slam the lid on the pot. It cuts off the oxygen, and without the oxygen the fire can't burn, so it'll turn off. By this point, if your oil has caught fire, your smoke alarm is probably also screaming at you, so this would be a good time to press the button to turn it off. One of these days somebody's going to invent a smoke alarm where you can yell at the smoke alarm, "I'm just cooking, calm down," and it'll shut up, and then you don't have to go talk to it. But until such point, have that pot lid handy for you, so that you don't have to go searching for it in case you need it. So your dry towels, your pot holders, your oven gloves, um, all that stuff, you want to have it in a handy space so that in case you need it in an emergency, you can quickly get your hands on it. If you can't find a lid for that pot, like say for example it's like a wok or something like that, I believe if you dump salt on something, it'll do the same thing with cutting off the oxygen, and it won't catch on fire anymore. I believe baking soda does the same thing, but I'm not 100% sure, so double check with Google and see what is the safest method of putting out a fire if you don't have a fire extinguisher. Um, this also, so talking about having your mise en place, having your things ready, you also want to have your cooking utensils nearby. So anything that you need to stir, or like a spatula or whatever you need to manipulate the ingredients inside the pot, you want to have that close at hand, because again, the difference between burnt food and well done food is sometimes a matter of seconds. And if you can get that ladle or that stirring spoon into the pot very quickly and shuffle things around, it's gonna not burn. You're gonna have a well cooked thing. With things like potatoes and rice and other things that you're trying to get a crust on it, those margins of error are like seconds. It can go from beautiful and golden and crusty and that really lovely crunchy texture into blackened and burned very, very quickly. So if you don't have something handy to move things around, and you have to go searching for it, this again goes back to the whole: you shouldn't be rushing around. You should slow down, take things deliberately, do things methodically, so that you don't have to go fix your mistakes. Do it right the first time. Speed is accuracy. Just get it done right the first time, and you'll be fine. Um, Speaking of having everything ready for you, you also want to have a handy place to park things so that while you're cooking, you don't have to figure out where to keep it. It's not always safe to have the utensil, like the stirring spoon or whatever, hanging outside of the pot. This is in the case of if you have like a gas flame and you have a wooden stirring spoon, you don't necessarily want to have it hanging over the side because sometimes the gas flame can indeed burn your wooden utensil. If you have like a plastic handled utensil, again, you don't want to keep it over the edge of the pot because that can melt and make a mess. So you want to have some place to put that utensil down that isn't going to be the countertop or your stove top. First off, there's food on that stirring utensil. You don't want that getting on top of your stove top. Secondly, it's super easy to clean a spoon rest. It's a little bit more complicated to properly clean a stovetop or a countertop. Hitting like a spoon rest with some soap and water is a trivial task. A lot of you even have dishwashers. Just shove it in the dishwasher and it's fine. That's not so easy to do with something like your stove or your countertop. That takes a little bit more effort to clean. So if you try to avoid spills and putting down stuff on those surfaces as much as you can possibly do, it's going to make your life easier later when you're trying to clean up. If you don't have a spoon rest, it is perfectly valid to use a plate or like a bowl or something just to let that utensil park while you're in the process of cooking. So you're going to be reaching for it frequently, stirring the pot, putting it back down, stirring the pot, putting it back down. So you want to have some place for that to go. This also goes triple for if you're deep frying. You want to have some place to put the fried food where it can hang out until you're done with your full deep fry job. You don't want to have to go searching for that when the food in the oil is browning. You want to do that when it's, well ahead of time so that you're not searching for places to put these things. So like I said, all these things are to prevent you from rushing at the last minute and making easily preventable mistakes. You don't need to be making these mistakes. They're not necessary. There are ways to prevent them, and that's what we're discussing. If you're using a recipe and not something that you know how to cook already, so if you're reading a recipe, you want to read that recipe cover to cover, from top to bottom. Read all the ingredients separately. Make sure that you do a mental checklist. Do I have all this stuff? Then what I like to do is I'll match up the ingredients in the ingredient list with the instructions, because sometimes I can tell how good a recipe is based on if every single ingredient in the ingredient list is accounted for by the time I get to the instructions. If there's an ingredient in the instructions that is not mentioned in the ingredients list, I'm not going to trust that recipe writer to do a good job, because if they've ignored something that obvious, what if they ignored giving me a step that's critical to making sure that this dish comes out correctly? I'd rather not take that chance, so I'll just skip that recipe. You have Google, you have cookbooks, you have podcasts, you have YouTube videos. There's a million billion recipes out there. You'll find one that where somebody was methodical enough to make sure that they mention, all right, here's all the ingredients in the list, here's all the instructions on what to do with all those ingredients. Similarly, if you see an ingredient in the ingredients list and it doesn't show up in the instructions, stop and think about where that would be if you indeed still do want to use this recipe. So this happens a lot with family recipes that are passed on, amongst friends or family. You've watched this person, or this person who's made it has done it a million times, so they already know in their head what you're supposed to do with, for example, the golden raisins and the rice pilaf at the end of the day. Like they know you're going to fry it with some oil and then, add it as a garnish. They're well aware of this. They might not even think it's necessary to mention that in the instructions because it's such an obvious step for them that they don't even mention it. But if you can catch these little issues long before it becomes an issue later, you're not going to be stuck at the last minute trying to figure out, okay, I went and gathered this ingredient and it doesn't make any sense in this recipe. It doesn't go anywhere. The other reason why you're also reading the recipe is that you want to see if things generally make sense. This will come with experience over time. This happens a lot in baking recipes where if there's a typo in the cookbook or on the blog post or on the recipe site or whatever, um, sometimes you don't realize it until after the disaster has happened. If you would have taken the time to sit down and sit with that recipe and really think about what these ingredients are doing, it gives you the chance to troubleshoot any issues that can come up long before they become an issue later on. So I remember there was a baking powder biscuit recipe where it called for something like 2 cups of flour, the certain amount of fat, a little bit of salt, like a pinch of sugar just to round things out, and then it called for like 3 tablespoons of baking powder, not baking soda, baking powder. Um, for 2 cups of flour, 3 tablespoons of baking powder is an enormous quantity of baking powder. That's about a quarter cup of baking powder if you really, if you do the conversions. 3 tablespoons is about a quarter cup, give or take. Um, so when you have 2 cups of flour, 3 tablespoons of baking soda is an enormous quantity. I went back and reread the recipe, and in the instructions it says put the 3 teaspoons of baking powder into the recipe. 3 teaspoons is a reasonable amount. That's about a tablespoon, give or take. 3 tablespoons is an insane amount. It would absolutely not make any sense, and your biscuits would have come out a disaster if I hadn't caught it. Um, but what I'm saying is like I knew from experience that 2 cups of flour does not need 3 tablespoons of baking powder to make it rise. That's way too much. About a tablespoon is about the upper limit for about 2 cups of flour. So I spotted that issue and I managed to correct it before I made the actual recipe, and everything turned out just fine. It could have been that I wrote down the recipe the wrong way. It could have been that whoever gave me the recipe didn't realize that they were writing TB instead of, lowercase tsp. These things happen, but if you can spot them ahead of time, things start to make sense. This also goes for cooking recipes where people are saying like, oh, add 2-3 tablespoons of oil to the pot, then add like a pound of onions, pound of carrots, pound of celery, blah 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 blah. Fine. Then you'll get to the herbs and spices, and you'll say like you'll see something that says like add like a tablespoon of dried rosemary. That is a ridiculous amount of dried rosemary, no matter how much food you're making. Generally, with dried rosemary, it's a herb that can very very easily overpower things, so you want to go kind of easy on it. Same thing for thyme. Thyme can very easily overpower a dish if you're not careful with it. So start looking out for these little warning signs that something in the recipe is not right, and you can avoid these issues long before they happen. But if you read the recipe and everything's in the instructions list and everything's in the ingredients list and everything makes sense, and you spot, say for example, a step in that instructions list that is going to give you trouble, you can either choose to make another recipe or you can figure out how to make corrections so that this is not an issue for you. When I lived in Florida with my parents, they mainly used the oven as extra dish storage. So they wouldn't actually they would put a whole bunch of stuff into the oven because they never used it. So when I was younger, if a recipe called for me to use the oven, I would either skip the recipe or figure out how to do it without an oven. Um, your kitchen is going to be unique to its own needs, and you're going to find various recipes that ask you to do various steps that may or may not work for you. If you know what you're up for later on, you know how to prepare for it before it becomes an issue later on. So like read the recipe back to back, know, like match up the ingredients with the instructions, make sure that everything is what it says it is, and then go and try to make the thing. And believe you can do it, slow things down, have all your mise en place, have all your preparation in front of you, because now you're ready to do it. there's a very helpful tip that I learned from Julia Child on the recipe where I believe she made, I think it was called a Queen of Sheba cake or something like that. It was a chocolate cake which had multiple components, where she wanted to teach you how, let's learn all these baking techniques, let's learn all these cooking techniques. And one of the things that she said that she does when she bakes, um, because she's primarily a cook, Julia Child had some excellent baking recipes that I've used before that work just fine. Um, but that's not her primary thing. So she talked about when she does any baking, what she'll do is that she'll gather all the ingredients that she needs for that particular recipe, or that particular step of the recipe, because this was a multi-step recipe. Um, and she'll put it on a tray or like on a plate or something, and as and when she uses those ingredients, she takes it off of the tray so that when her tray is empty, she knows that she's added every single ingredient to that step. I think this is a very helpful technique for if you're baking something, because with baking, sometimes the ingredients list can get a little severe, like baking powder, baking soda, vinegar, vanilla extract, salt, sugar, any kind of spices that you're adding to this thing. All these things start to add up, and the last thing you want to have happen is that you've gone to all this effort to sift the flour and add the spices at the right time and do this whole thing, only to find out it's been in the oven for a half an hour now and you still never added the baking soda to the thing, so it's not going to lift and it's going to be a hockey puck when it comes out. That's not an experience anybody wants to go through. So this technique of, let's have everything in one place, and then as and when I'm using it, I'll open it, use the thing and put it to a separate place. Don't put it back on the tray, because if you put it back on the tray, now you're going to think I didn't add this thing, and I still need to use it. So it's all part of taking your time and doing this right, and whatever. If you're a nervous cook and you have a recipe, especially the Indian recipes, and let's be honest, even my recipes, where they call for a long list of spices, and you're trying to get your act together to make all those spices happen in your recipe, it might be a good idea to just set everything out in front of you on a tray. Or I have the spice box that the Indians use, where it's these little bowls that is inside a larger metal box, and each of those bowls has one of the spices that you use for everyday cooking. And what I'll do is that I'll gather everything right next to my stovetop when I'm making something with a lot of spices in it, and I find that it makes everything go very quickly, because then I'm not searching, I'm not opening bottles, I'm not making myself crazy. It's all right here, it's ready to use, I add it into the recipe when I need it, done, done, done. Very, very quick. So this was a very handy technique that I learned about baking, that I've been using ever since. I don't necessarily use the like a tray or something, but what I'll do is that I'll say, for example, I'll use the left hand side of my workstation as where I'm putting all the ingredients that I haven't used yet. I'll open everything, and then as and when I'm using it, I'll put the lid on and move it to the right hand side of my workbench, so that I don't have to reach for that ingredient again because I've already used it. Whatever way this works for you, I think it's a helpful technique that I want to share with you guys. So um, take that as you will. Um, final couple of things. You want to clean your mess as you go. So we'll take the vegetable soup example. I'll do all of one step at one time. So if it's time to peel the vegetables, I'll peel all the vegetables at the same time. So the potatoes, the daikon, the carrots, the onions, the garlic. I don't peel ginger, but if I wanted to peel ginger, I would peel it at this point, because then I have a nice little stack of peels that I can throw in the garbage can and get it out of the way all at once. Then I can wash all my vegetables once they've been peeled all at once. This goes much, much quicker. What I've learned from restaurants is that when you're doing a certain task, like peeling vegetables, your body is in the motion of doing that task. It's almost like muscle memory at that point. If you have to interrupt that task with another task, so say for example you peel one potato and then chop it, you're breaking the cycle of that muscle memory. You want to be able to just, okay, peel, 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 set aside. Next potato, peel, peel, peel. If you keep yourself in that rhythm, in that groove, and you're making all your trash at one time, it makes it so that things happen a lot more efficiently. Then once everything is peeled, you throw out all the peels, you wipe down your countertop so that it's clean again. You go wash all your vegetables with plenty of clean water. You bring it back to your workstation, and then now you start chopping all your vegetables. And so if you if you will clean up as you go along, you're not going to end up with a big giant mess when you're done cooking. It also is a safety issue. If you have lots and lots of garbage piling up around you on your workbench, you're going to have less space to work. And we've discussed this several episodes where I talk about how you want to have as much space on your cutting board to do the physical job of cutting. You don't want to be crowded into a small little spot on your cutting board. You want to have as much space as you can have. So as much as you can clear the decks, get it into a bowl, get it out of your face so that it's not sitting on your cutting board parked there, the safer it's going to be for you. You're not going to make as many mistakes cutting yourself or mischopping the vegetables or chopping them of the wrong size. Um, Basically, give yourself a clean workspace to begin and keep it clean as you go along so that when you're done cooking, the final things that you really have to do is the dinner dishes and whatever pots or pans that you cooked in, and not this giant pile of prep bowls and cutting boards and work surfaces and everything else. You don't want to have to do this giant cleaning job while you're after you're cooking. So like while something is parked on the stove at a simmer, you now have some time to clean up after yourself. This is a really good time to clean up after yourself so that you keep a clean workspace. A clean workspace is a safe workspace, which is also a pleasant workspace. It's nice to work in clean surroundings, and as much as you can do to keep it clean, go ahead and do that thing. Um, and the final note for you guys about beginner cooks or getting comfortable with cooking is don't take on more than you can realistically do in a sitting. I mentioned at the beginning of this video that I've been cooking for decades. I've been cooking for a very, very long time. I've done it professionally. I've done it for fun. I've done all kinds of cooking. I know that if I'm making a meal, I know that I can expect a certain amount of time that it's going to take. And I know that in my head, when I'm planning the meal, before I even go shopping, after I've gone shopping and I have all my ingredients, when I'm planning that meal, I know that there are certain things that are going to take a long time that I just need to let them do their own thing and leave me alone, and I don't have to babysit it. One of these things is rice. So when I make rice, I'll park it in the rice cooker, hit start, and then go about the rest of my business. If I'm doing roasted vegetables, this is why when I cook in someone else's house, and there's limited stove space or there's limited workspace, what I'll do is that I generally tend to do at least one roasted vegetable option that's done in the oven, because I can toss it with the spices, I can toss it with some salt, put it on a baking sheet, shove it in the oven at 350 degrees, set the timer for about 25 minutes because that's pretty much what all roasted vegetables take, and let it do its own thing. And now that's one fewer thing that I have to babysit, which makes it a lot easier on me when I'm making a more involved meal. If it's just for me, I'll throw something in the microwave and, have that as my steamed vegetable side and, heat something else up from the stove as leftovers and I'm fine. But if I'm making something like a proper dinner for somebody and I want to have a vegetable side, I'll park it in the oven so that I don't have to keep after it. I've done the spicing. Chopping, spicing, and shoving in the oven is barely like a 5-minute job, because I know roughly what spices and herbs that I'm going to put on there. Some salt, some pepper, some canola oil or peanut oil or vegetable oil. Throw it in the oven at 350 for about 25 minutes, and let it do its own thing, and it's fine. So as many things as you can do, so that you're not actively cooking, do that so that you don't take on too much of a task and then overwhelm yourself by the time that the meal's done and now you're exhausted and you've lost your appetite. What's better is that you just give yourself enough time to do the job at hand, and don't take on more than you can realistically handle. Again, on this TV show, they regularly give them challenges of more than a person should really be handling at once. And they expect them to do it in that compressed time format because, again, it's a competition reality show, and they need to create drama so that there's some tension, so the viewers don't get bored watching. I, for one, would like it if we had less of that tension, less of that yelling and the going crazy and running around, and more of oh wow, I learned that I can do this thing because I was given a reasonable amount of time to do it, and I was given the tools to do it with, and I had people backing me up where they could answer my questions when I had questions. That would be cool for me to watch, but I teach cooking, so what do I know, right? So if you have the option to do a thing and then park it somewhere so you don't have to babysit it, do that thing so that you cut back on your workload of active cooking time. Active cooking time, I would consider standing at the stove, stirring things, keeping an eye on it, making sure it's not burning, adjusting the temperature, dropping it from medium to a simmer, or vice versa. Those are all active cooking times, and they take a lot out of you. It does take a lot of energy to do active cooking time. So, like, whatever you can do to park it and just, do its own thing. This is why I think that a lot of people love that Instapot so much, is because they don't have to babysit it like they would a regular pressure cooker on the stove. They can hit start on the machine, it'll do its own thing, and then it's done. And then you add some tarka from the stove and spice it up, and you're done. It's not a complicated thing. So if you know that you're a beginner cook, and you know that you have, for example, company coming over, and you know that you would like to have a little bit more of an elaborate meal than rice and a vegetable, rice and beans, you'd like to have something a little bit more elaborate. What I would suggest that you do is take on like one or two dishes that you can make ahead of time and make it throughout the week, so that when that person comes over, or when those people come over, you've got like an arsenal of stuff in your fridge that you just have to reheat, either in the oven or in the microwave or whatever, or on the stove or whatever you use to reheat, so that you're not overwhelming yourself with more than you can handle at once. I do this all the time, and I'm an experienced cook. When I know I have company coming over, I am the number one fan of make it ahead of time, park it in the fridge. Then when everybody comes over, I need basically like a 15-20 minutes notice that they're headed over, and I'm done, 5 minutes in the microwave, and everything's ready, piping hot when everybody shows up. And to make it look like I've actually been cooking in the kitchen, I'll throw on a pot of rice or something like that, and that'll come fresh from the rice cooker. Now it really looks like I've been doing something, whereas I've been making all this stuff over the week, because I work a full-time job. So when I get home, I don't always have the wherewithal to make like a full 4, 5, 6 course meal. I'd rather just do one thing that night, have a little bit of it, so I can do quality control, and park it in the fridge so that when my company comes over, I'm not scrambling, that I'm not rushing, that I'm not doing all those things that cause accidents. And this is coming from somebody who's a very advanced cook. I've been cooking for years. I consider myself a very good cook. I'm a competent cook, and I know what I'm doing. So if even I do these techniques like making stuff ahead of time, or parking something in the rice cooker, or shoving something in the oven to do its own thing, I don't think you should feel any shame for doing it yourself. I think it doesn't make any sense to put yourself through more aggravation than you absolutely have to. Going back to these competition reality shows, if you've ever watched like Top Chef or Master Chef, or all these other shows where they have cooking competitions, you'll notice that very frequently what the judges will say is, why did you overcomplicate this? Why did you make this so much more difficult than it needed to be? You would have done a perfectly great job, rather than making this one thing 3 ways, if you had just made it perfectly one way. That's all we asked you to do. We didn't ask you to go crazy and make, 30 different dishes on a cacophonous plate. We asked you to do one thing and do it well. So same thing goes for the home cook. Is like, why are we complicating things to where you want to, do things exactly like it's always been done or follow the tradition or whatever? Traditions are made to be created. Like, just because your family's always done something a certain way all this time doesn't mean that that's the right way to, for you. Um, every time I cook with somebody for Thanksgiving, I don't make the same thing. We're not making mashed potatoes and green bean casserole. If they wanted to do all that, they can do it on their own. I'm coming over and we're making unique, different dishes based on whatever's looking good in the stove in the store, which means that I'm I'm gonna use a lot of these techniques on myself to make it easier on myself. I'm not going to present you mushrooms 6 ways. I'm going to do, mushrooms as part of a dish. One dish, and it's only going in one dish. Or if I'm making a rice dish, I'll just have it be plain rice, maybe with a little bit of cumin seed and some olive oil for some flavor. That's about it. I'm really not going to complicate the rice too much because, to be honest, I'd rather just hit start on the rice cooker and then forget that I have to even deal with it. So like, take a hint. You don't have to overcomplicate things. You don't have to overdo things. Take as many shortcuts as you need to get the job done. If you don't have the patience to chop up all these vegetables to make these elaborate curry pastes and things like that, buy the packet, shove it in there, and you're still cooking at home. It's fine. But it's like, don't think that you have to go to this insane level of commitment to make a meal, especially if it's for somebody else, when realistically, the fun part of the dinner party is sharing the meal together and the conversations that you have. It's not necessarily anybody's bothered about how elaborate the meal is or, how much aggravation you put yourself through to get the thing done. So like, use as many little savers, little helpers that you can in the kitchen to get yourself in a place where you're not stressed out and you're not freaking out. If you can realistically do one dish in a night, do the one dish, do it very, very well, and then put up leftovers on either the freezer or the fridge, and then reheat it when you have company. That's why we have refrigeration and freezers in the house, is so that we can put stuff up for later. But the don't take on more than you can realistically do also goes back to the can-do attitude, where it's like, if you're going into the cooking situation where you already know that you're trying to set yourself up for success all along the way, the positive attitude is a lot easier to come by. If you know that every time you get into the kitchen that you're gonna take just 2-3 minutes and just clear down the decks, wipe down the countertops, wipe down the stovetop so it's nice and clean, have everything laid out for you, ready to go. It's almost like you're preparing for battle and putting on your armor and just getting yourself ready. The more things that you can do to make yourself have an easier time and a more fun time are going to make sure that you have an easier time and a more fun time, and it takes away some of that anxiety and that fear that comes from being a beginner cook. So we have gone on for nearly an hour. If you all have any thoughts about what we talked about today, or if you have any suggestions for beginner cooks on how to reduce some of that anxiety, please share them in the comments below. I would love to hear from you. I may not always answer immediately, but I do read every single comment. So thank you very much for watching, and I will catch you next time. Bye.